Hello everyone and welcome to the second lecture on decision making and the brain. In this lecture, I'm going to be loosely organizing the talk around the topic of manipulating decision making. Now, of course, this will be a mix of things that affect our decisions and the way we, as psychologists or as biologists, but also companies, organizations, or even individuals, can make use of these techniques. In this talk, I'm going to be going over 4 different course topics. These will be the influence of emotions on decisions, reward. I'll be talking quite a bit about different forms of game theory, and I'll also be going over punishment a little bit. So, starting off about emotions and decision making. In order to explain this topic, we'll have to go back a little ways to the 19th century USA. Now, this is a story of a man called Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railway construction foreman. And when they would prepare the terrain to make a railway, they would often use explosives. And so this is Phineas Gage. And these explosives, they would push down clay on top of them using a metal rod. A rod that's a little over 1 meter long, or 3 feet and 7 inches for the metrically challenged, and over 3 centimeters wide, or 1¼ inch. Now, Phineas Gage had the misfortune of quite literally being in the wrong place at the wrong time. As he was shoving down this rod, the explosives went off, just as his head was positioned right over the blast hole. The metal rod shot up through his upper jaw, his eye socket, his frontal lobe, some more skull at the top, and out. It finally landed point first in the ground, 25 meters away. This is a quote from his doctor. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little respect for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times obstinate, capricious, and vacillating, devising many plans of future operation, which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned, in turn for others appearing more easable. His mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. So, the man survived, blew out part of his brain, and changed. But the interesting thing is, based on cognitive tests like his ability to think, he seemed fine. He didn't seem all that affected. But his personality and his decision-making had been sorely impaired. And this story and later studies by Antonio Damasio of subjects with similar but somewhat less dramatic lesions in the same set of brain regions brought us to a revision of the importance of emotional processes in our decision making. And this is what's known as the somatic marker hypothesis. So this is work from Antonio Damasio. And the basic premise here is that we sense our emotional processes based on what we feel in our own body. So literally a gut feeling. The interesting thing here is that our ability to sense this happens before we are consciously aware of the thing that is giving us this emotional valence, and it can directly affect our decision making. So, how did Damasio test this? Well, he used a task called the Iowa gambling task. And in this task, the subject gets to pick a card from a set of 4 decks. Now, what the subject doesn't know is that these decks have different probabilities of events associated with them, as you can see here. These probabilities have been manipulated in such a way that the most common card in the 2 bad decks is actually a relatively big win, whereas the most common card in the good decks is actually a relatively small win. However, every once in a while, there will be a loss card, and that loss will be way bigger in the bad decks, so in this case a 1250 loss, than it will in the good decks where it's a 250 loss. So C and D in this case are the same, and A and B are the same. But the point is, the rewards you get here are bigger, but the loss is so big that it offsets that. This creates a sense over time, as the subject is trying to figure out which of these decks are good and bad and what they should pick from, that they become a little bit afraid of picking from these decks, because every once in a while there's a really, really bad card in there, right? Now, the interesting thing is that while a lot of cognitive tests show that people with damage to their ventromedial prefrontal cortex, they perform normal on all kinds of cognitive tests. But this task, they actually show a big deficit in. And what happens is that people with ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesion will keep pulling cards from the bad decks, even when there's this big negative effect. So what happens, we can also measure one of these bodily responses to these scary stimuli, right? And this is the galvanic skin response, basically your sweaty palms. So if you sweat because something something that makes you nervous is happening, then your electric conductivity of your, in this case, fingertips, for example, increases. So you get a galvanic skin response. Yes, there's a typo there. Thank you, Valena. So this galvanic skin response is a measurement of your bodily reaction to these stimuli. Now, when picking from one of these decks, you can see the size of the galvanic skin response. What we see is that in the control group, so the healthy subjects, the response is bigger right before they pick from a bad risky deck than it is from the other decks. In the subjects with the ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesion, there is no such difference present. Okay, so these people apparently don't have the nervousness that you would get when you're about to make a scary decision. But the interesting thing here is that we can dissociate between what they choose and their conscious awareness of the risk. So, in order to show you that, I need to explain a little bit about the phases here. So what they've done is they've had the subjects tell the researcher what they thought was happening. Before they've ever gotten a negative event, obviously they really didn't know the structure of the task. And at some point they started developing a hunch where they would say, okay, I have the feeling like these might be worse, but I'm not entirely sure, or I have the idea that these might be bad. And then during the conceptual phase, so the fourth phase in this, they actually can explain, okay, these cards have a bigger negative effect, therefore overall they're worse, right? Okay, so those are the 4 phases that we have. Now what we see here is that in the hunch phase, so when they don't exactly know how to describe what's happening, the healthy control subjects are already starting to pick fewer of the bad cards, right? So they've reduced their willingness to pick decks A and B, even though they don't quite know what's going on yet. So they're not yet conscious of the entire task structure, but they're still able to make the right choice. What's even weirder, the subjects who have a lesion in their ventromedial prefrontal cortex have an inability to pick the right decks during the conceptual period. So they are able to tell the researcher, yeah, decks A and B have such a big negative event that it would be a bad pick. These are the bad decks. These are the good decks. Yet even during the conscious phase where they can actually describe all of this, they still wind up picking the bad decks quite frequently. So this shows that there's a dissociation between our conscious awareness of what good and bad decisions are and our gut feeling and what we wind up going with. Again, strong support for the importance of emotional processes in decision making. Now, this should not surprise us too much when we think about all kinds of other emotional processes and decisions that we make. I mean, Some of us are smokers or gamers. Some people are depressed or even psychopaths, right? And all of these include examples of things that we know we shouldn't do, or things that we know aren't real, but we feel them anyway, or things that we know are morally wrong, but we don't let that stop us. So in this case, the role of our gut feeling in decisions is once again supported. Now, there was a suggestion for more causal support for this hypothesis, for the somatic marker hypothesis. However, this turns out not to replicate. So the idea was you have people hold a pen in a certain shape, so either between their lips or between their teeth, and then you force them to create a smile on their face and have them rate comics. But sadly, it turns out that this effect does not replicate. So, if we know that our emotions affect our decisions, then of course, being able to change people's emotions also affects the way we make them make decisions, and that can be a helpful lever. We see overall that people who are more angry or more happy tend to be more risk-taking, whereas people who are more sad or more scared tend to become more risk-averse. So this is not necessarily better or worse at decision-making, because you can manipulate whether high risk is advantageous or disadvantageous, and that doesn't really matter for the impact of the emotional state. So it's not like people who are happy make better decisions or people who are scared make better decisions, but rather riskier and less risky decisions. Of course, being researchers, we don't just want to study what people's natural mood is and how it affects their decision, but we also want to be able to manipulate this, right? What happens if we make them think this way or feel this way? And so typically what psychologists will do is something called mood induction, where we try to make people feel a certain way in order to see how this affects their behavior, in this case, their decision-making processes. Typical ways of doing this is having them listen to happy or sad music, or having them recall a memory that makes them happy or sad, or have them watch a very sad video, like Mufasa's death. So, this is not just something done in the lab when doing psychology research. This is also something that people do when thinking about advertising or the music you hear in a supermarket, right? This affects a lot of things. There is, however, something very fishy going on here. So it turns out that people who are in a positive mood are more likely to answer yes to the question you ask them than people who are in a negative mood. However, if we then take the way we define the question and we flip it around so that the meanings change, they're still more likely to say yes. So take the trolley dilemma from the previous class, and people have two options, and they can either act or not act. If we then ask them, is it okay to be active and pull the lever? Then yes means a change in track, and no means go straight. If you ask them, is it okay to be passive and do nothing? Then yes means no change in track, so it goes straight, whereas no means a change in track. And in either of these cases, giving people a more positive mood will make them more likely to say, yes, this is okay, even though the meaning is exactly opposite. So again, this is a way we can manipulate decisions. If you can figure out how people are feeling, you can frame your questions in such a way that their bias in responding matches the thing you want them to say. This could be very helpful for companies like Facebook, which tend to want to push people in certain directions anyway. This, to me, is a very, very scary one. This graph shows decisions by judges in minor criminal law. So on the x-axis, we have the time of day. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of a judge's decisions in favor of the defendant. So high here means a higher chance of the defendant getting off, and low means a higher chance of them getting convicted. What we see here on the graph is the progress of a day where it starts fairly high and it gradually lowers, so the decision the judge will make becomes worse and worse for the defendant until there's a break with food, and then it gets worse again until there's a break with food, and then it gets worse again. So, and these are not trivial decisions, right? These are judges making actual calls, and so the effect this can have on people's lives is quite significant. In fact, if I were a defense attorney and my client had a call made on him that negatively affected him right before lunch, I would probably pull up this study and say, well, I'd like to appeal because the judge was hangry, right? We've all seen the Snickers ads as well that go into you're just not yourself when you're hungry. So, scary stuff, this. In the next phase, I'll be talking a little bit about reward. And reward is one particular kind of outcome of an event that we do. And these outcomes and rewards can be of different kinds. For example, a standard research experiment would use money as a reward, but we can also use, for example, erotic stimuli to see how people would respond, be willing to work for, etc. Funnily enough, when we put them in the MRI scanner, we can actually see a difference in terms of where in the orbitofrontal cortex. Remember, the orbit is the eye socket, so the orbitofrontal cortex is just above that. We see that the activity for a financial reward is more anterior, so more on the front side, compared to activity for an erotic reward. While the differences are fairly minor, I do think this makes sense in our view of more abstract, long-term cognitive planning activity lying more anterior in the cortex, whereas less high-end and more intuitive lie more posterior in the cortex. Outside of the cortex, we would say that more abstract, highly developed thoughts are more on the outside, and more intuitive, impulsive things are more on the inside of the brain. Another way of looking at values is with Pavlovian conditioning, of course. And you're probably well aware of this classical experiment. It was discovered by accident. Pavlov was actually interested in how the processing of food in dogs' systems work. And when he realized that the dog would start salivating when he came in with the food, he thought, oh, I'll have to figure out how this works. So in the standard way of responding to a stimulus, such as food, what we see is that, okay, food arrives, this is called the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response, so we don't need to do any conditioning to get this, is that the dog starts salivating when the food arrives. So there is food, I drool. What happens is, if we, every time before the food arrives, we ring a little bell, then at some point the dog will start to associate the bell with the food and start salivating. So then if the conditioned stimulus, the bell, rings, then even in the absence of food, the dog is already starting to salivate. So that is a conditioned response. It's the same response, but now not unconditioned based on the food, but conditioned based on the bell that is supposed to predict the food. We can ask ourselves, so what is really happening here? Is the dog simply making a shortcut where bells mean drooling regardless? Or is it learning the bell predicts the food, therefore I should be drooling? So basically, is there a stimulus learning going on where hearing the bell means we expect the food and therefore we start drooling? Or is there a more direct stimulus response learning going on where, okay, every time after we've heard the bell, we wound up drooling, so let's cut out the middleman and simply start drooling. In order to figure this out, one thing we can do is we can devalue the unconditioned stimulus. So, say that, for example, we make the food no longer appealing to the dog, right? If we were to learn that the bell predicts the food, and suddenly we don't really care about the food, then we wouldn't expect salivating. However, if the bell simply leads to drooling, and we don't care about the food, then the bell should still lead to drooling because it's not relying on the link between food and drooling. So how do we do that? Well, for example, what we can do is we can oversaturate your satisfaction for a particular kind of food. If I give you lots and lots and lots of peanut butter, and the bell predicts more peanut butter, then you might not actually wind up drooling anymore if we ring the bell, right? So making one of the options that is predicted less appealing, we can see how much of the activation is linked to the cue, so the bell, or to the outcome it predicts. And we can do that in fMRI as well. So what we see here is the appreciation for food before after eating, and also the appreciation of a valued and a devalued stimulus. So the kind of food that you've had too much of, or the kind of food that you still enjoy. What we see in the imaging finding is that the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, the reward center of the brain, show a reduced activity towards the devalued stimulus, which makes a lot of sense. So what we wind up with is emotion, probability, and reward all being affected to some extent by the devalued stimulus. Another way that we can test whether we see stimulus-stimulus learning or stimulus-response learning is by using a method called sensory preconditioning. What do we mean by that? Well, if we, for now, leave out the food entirely and we give them a bell that predicts a second sound, and the second sound is not yet associated with anything, but we let them hear bell A and bell B, and then we let them hear bell A and it's followed again by bell B, and again, until they've learned this association. If we then train them on bell B, and whenever they hear bell B, we give them food, then at some point, obviously, bell B leads to drooling even in the absence of food, right? Let's show this in a more intuitive manner. So now the question is, we've come to associate bell A with bell B, and then we teach the dog bell B leads to food, so bell B causes the dog to drool. The question is, what happens if we then ring bell A? Will this make the dog drool? If what is going on is actually stimulus-stimulus learning, then hearing bell A should predict bell B, which should predict the food, therefore the dog should drool. If there's simply stimulus-response learning going on, bell A never got associated with drooling, and therefore we should not see any response. This is indeed the case. So when we devalue a stimulus, we see a reduced response to the cue, which means that apparently we don't have as much of a tendency to drool based on the bell, simply because we don't care about the bloody peanut butter. In the preconditioning, we see that there is still a presence of a conditioned response to the first conditioned stimulus, which has never been associated with that response directly, only via its prediction of the second. From this, we can conclude that Pavlovian conditioning is indeed a link between stimulus and stimulus. However, it turns out that in order for us to have this kind of conditioning, the stimulus that we try to link to needs to be additionally predictive. It needs to have a novel predictive value. What do I mean by that? Well, say that we have two conditioned stimuli. One is a bell and two is a light. If we train our subject on both of these at the same time, then they'll show a strong response when they're both shown, and they'll show a mild response when either of them is shown. However, if we take their learning and divide it up in two phases, first they learn an association between the first stimulus, so the light, and the food, and then after that we try to teach them that light plus bell means food, what they wind up with is not really developing much conditioning based on the bell. Why is that? Well, what's happening is every time they see the light, this predicts them getting food. So they'll start drooling based on the light. When they see the light and the bell together, the food that they're getting is already predicted because they see the light. Therefore, the bell doesn't have any additional predictive value, right? The food was already expected based on the light, so we don't learn to associate the bell. So when we only hear the bell, there's no drooling because it doesn't predict, oh, there should be food coming up. One way to model a lot of these things is using temporal difference learning. It's basically a mathematical model of things like conditioning and action selection. We assign value to different states. And this gives us basically a prediction of the reward that we expect to get. And once we've learned an association, then we expect to get the reward when we hear the bell instead of when we see the food, right? This means that there's a large value for unexpected reward and a very low negative value for rewards that are absent but would be expected. Normally, if I were teaching this class in a classroom, I would actually be going around ringing a little bell and handing out candy. Sadly, I cannot do that here on Twitch or on YouTube, but what I can do is ask you to imagine. So that's what we're going to do. So, imagine that what I have here is your very favorite kind of candy. If Engelse drop happens to be your very favorite kind of candy, imagining just got easier. So, I'm walking up to you in class, and as I walk up to you, I ring the bell, and I give you a piece of candy. Okay, so far so good. This is nice. I got candy. That's really all we want from life. Again, I come up to you, bing, and I give you candy. The second time this happens, the bell has become more relevant to you. You feel this little, yay, there's a bell. This means I'm going to get candy, right? The moment you actually get the candy, it's actually not that informative anymore because you're already kind of expecting it because you heard the bell before. So again, I'm coming up to you, ding. Again, you get candy. Now the bell is important. The bell is the signal. That's when you get happy. You hear that and you think, oh yes, candy. The candy is becoming less important because it was predictable. We already knew it was coming because we heard the bell. So we already had that excitement, right? Now, again, the bell, ding, and nothing. So now what happens is we've heard the bell, we've had the excitement, we've had the rush of, yay, this means reward, and then it wasn't there. Suddenly, we feel disappointed. We had a reward that we predicted was coming, and it wasn't. So we feel this negative event of the absence of a reward that we had predicted. So a model like temporal difference learning can actually account for these. What we see here is what we call the reward prediction error. Basically, the change in how much reward we expect to get based on events. First off, here's what would happen if we have no prediction, but suddenly we get reward, right? There's a bell, but we don't know what it means, or there's no signal, and we get candy. Yay, candy is happening. We're happy about candy. Over time, as we get more and more used to the fact that the bell predicts the candy, what happens is the reward prediction error gets high when we hear the bell. And it's absent when we get the candy because the candy had already been predicted. The candy was expected, therefore it was not the thing that gave us this reward prediction error. The last example, we hear the bell, we go, yay! And then the candy is absent. What we see is the reward prediction error actually going negative, so below a certain baseline level. We have the event of the unexpected absence of reward. It would still have a minor peak if we are still learning to predict it, or if the prediction is not 100% certain. Yeah, sure. So another cool thing with models like these is they can also adjust their predictions over time. This is a bit of a more complicated format. I'll walk you through it. What happens here is basically, again, we have we have 4 different kinds of cues that we give. A is actually highly predictive of B. And B, in this case, it's not a reward, but a pain signal. B predicts a high level of pain. C is highly predictive of D, and D precedes a high level of pain, right? So from B to high pain is guaranteed. And from D to low pain is also guaranteed. But from A to B is probabilistic. So 41% of times we go from here to here, 41% we go from here to here, but in 9% of trials we actually cross over. So A might still lead to D, and C might still lead to B in this case. So what's happening is we start to learn first B is bad and D is good. And then gradually we start to learn, okay, A is bad because it leads to B, and C is bad because it leads to D. Now what we see in this in these different trial types is, okay, here we have 3 different graphs showing what's happening when we haven't learned anything yet. So these 2 are a bit different to tell aside. This is the value of the temporal difference, and this is the temporal difference reward prediction error. This is the one that we're actually most interested in, and it's basically the derivative of this one. So where here we see, okay, outcome is bad, or in this case we're predicting pain. So outcome is high, higher, low. And what we see here is basically the change. So the outcome goes up, it goes up a little bit, and it stays flat, right? And these changes, they are learned gradually during different parts of the experiment. So when we haven't learned anything yet, what we see is that there's a strong response to the outcome, right? Because the outcome was not predictable. So we have a high level of pain. Oh, that's here. If we're halfway through our learning, then the response becomes less to the outcome and more to the situation that strongly predicts that outcome. But when we've fully learned the contingency of the task, then getting QA becomes the thing that we respond strongly to, because QA tells us that QB is probably coming. So that's this one. QB was already expected. So QB only has a small effect because we kind of already saw it coming. And the pain itself was fully predicted by QB, so we never even respond to that. So in the late phase of learning, you see that it gradually shifts from the predicted thing to the predictor to the predictor of the predictor, right? And so this model can account for this gradual backwards learning of stimuli. And the cool thing is that this kind of effect, where first we respond to the actual reward, but later we start to respond to the things that predict the reward, those things can be found in the brain as well. So here we see an early response to the stimulus, say to the candy, and a late response to the bell that predicts it. Now, what I'm going to show you next are actually findings from a monkey's brain. These are studies done by Wolfram Schultz, a very famous finding. And these are the firing of dopaminergic neurons in the basal ganglia. So these are actually in the substantia nigra projecting to the basal ganglia, I should say. In order to read these plots, I should briefly explain what they show. Each line here is the firing of a single neuron in this region, and each dot is the moment where the neuron fires. And if we look at the top, we see a histogram, which basically shows the sum of the activity of all the neurons that are measured below. So in this first case, this is the candy where the bell didn't mean anything to us yet. What we see is that there's no conditioned stimulus, or there is one, but it hasn't been conditioned yet. And what we see is that there's not much activity here, just a baseline firing. And then when we get the candy, yay, our dopamine neurons go, this is nice, we like candy. After we've trained you a couple of times that, okay, bell means candy, what we see is that these dopaminergic neurons, they fire when we hear the bell. Bell rings, dopamine neurons go, yay, candy has been predicted. Candy happens, they're just at baseline. They already knew this was happening, so they don't care about that anymore. So there's no reward prediction error. The reward's there, but it was already predicted, so the error is 0. In this last one, we show what happens when the predicted reward is absent. So here we see a baseline firing, the bell rings, dopamine neurons go, yay! And then the candy is absent, and what you can see here is actually a dip where the firing gets below baseline level. So this is effectively a negative signaling in your dopamine system. And there are neurons in your basal ganglia that specifically respond to the presence of such a dopamine peak. But there are others with a different kind of receptor, which is inhibitory, that actually respond to the presence of such a dip. So those are constantly inhibited by the baseline, but they go negative the moment you get absence of a predicted reward. Those are the ones that teach you what not to do. Hey, something went wrong, something went worse than expected, I should do something about that. So, a lot of studies will try and make a big point about seeing reward-related regions, such as the ventral striatum, light up in experiments where they don't actually do a reward-related task. We should be a little bit careful with trying to make a big deal out of that, because humans are inherently social animals. When we do a task well, and especially when we get feedback on doing the task well, like someone saying that was correct, then we consider that rewarding in and of itself. So our innate sense of what we find rewarding gets triggered by someone saying, you did good. Okay. The next part of the lecture is a fairly lengthy one, and I think we are at a good moment for a break. So what I'm going to do is stop recording, address questions, and then actually go on a short break myself. So, this next part of the lecture, we're going to be talking about game theory quite a bit. And game theory is a big part of the way we can study how people make decisions in relation to each other. And of course, this has to do with the desire to please the people around us, but also the desire to have things for ourselves. One core concept in game theory is the Nash equilibrium. The mathematician who made this also features in the movie A Beautiful Mind, which you might be familiar with. The Nash equilibrium is formally described as a state where unilaterally changing your choice will not improve your outcome. So this means that if you are in the Nash equilibrium as, say, a duo doing a task, then I cannot make my outcome better by changing my decision. It doesn't mean we together have the optimal outcome. Quite the contrary. In a lot of these cases, it doesn't. But it does mean that I could not make our outcome better unless you change yours. And if we are both fully rational and fully aware of the task's sets of outcomes, then we should wind up in this Nash equilibrium. People often don't. And of course, that's where things get interesting, because people are more interesting than optimal decision makers. So I already gave one example of game theory in the previous lecture, the ultimatum game. So in this case, we give the first subject a bunch of money. We allow them to offer a portion of that to the second subject. If the second subject says, I will accept this deal, then they both get money based on that deal. But if the second subject says no, then neither of them gets anything. So this is, of course, an example of game theory. Just to get your mind around the concept, what would the Nash equilibrium be in this case? What would you offer if you were the person being allowed to make an offer? I'll let you think about that for a second. Remember that you're both selfish and fully aware of the task contingencies, and the other person is also selfish and fully aware of the task contingencies. Now, the correct answer is to offer the lowest non-zero amount you can. So say that we get $10 and I get to give you a certain amount, then I could give you 1 and keep 9 for myself. Why? Because I know that you are fully rational and fully selfish, which means you will accept the 1 because it's more than the 0 you would get if you said no. Because I know this, I don't have to offer you anything more for you to take it. So the Nash equilibrium says you give the lowest amount you can because the other person doesn't have anything to gain by saying no to the deal. Of course, with real people, turns out that we're willing to do the altruistic punishment thing. Yep. The next example is indeed one of the most famous examples of game theory, the prisoner's dilemma. In this case, we have two people, person A and person B. The idea is that they're both held separately in different cells, and they both have the option of speaking to the cops and ratting the other person out, or keeping silent and actually protecting the other person. The interesting thing that makes this worthwhile is the payoff matrix, as it's called. If both people in their different cells are willing to rat the other person out, what happens is they both get a fairly lengthy jail sentence. So A confesses, B confesses, they both go to prison for 5 years. If they both choose to protect the other, and therefore also both are protected, then they'll only have to serve a jail sentence of 1 year. However, if you are choosing to protect the other, but the other is willing to rat you out, you go to jail for 20 years and the other one goes scot-free. So, again, what would the Nash equilibrium tell you to do? The situation where you cannot unilaterally improve your decision. As you may have guessed, in the Nash equilibrium, it's always better to accuse the other person, to confess, and to be the one who talks. Because if you are person A, then if person B confesses, you're better off doing 5 years than 20. If person B remains silent, you're better off doing 0 years than 1 year. So no matter what the other person does, you're better off talking. Since this is symmetrical, The same thing goes for prisoner B. Prisoner B is better off talking than remaining silent, regardless of what prisoner A does. Now, this is of course a bit problematic, because the group optimum for prisoner A and B together is clearly here. They both only wind up in jail for 1 year. So if they were able to coordinate and make a deal and keep each other to that deal, this is where they want to be at. But behaving selfishly and rationally, they would always wind up in the Nash equilibrium right over here. It's worth noting that it matters a lot whether we're doing one-shot interactions with anonymous people or we're doing an iterative run. If you know that you're going to be doing the same prison experiment with the same opponent slash ally, then suddenly it becomes worth their liking of you, their social contract with you gets a value. So it becomes less straightforward to compute the optimum. If you know that you're going to do 5 trials with someone else, then the optimum is to do confess in the first 4 and then defect in the 5th, right? But importantly, real life isn't usually this constrained. Real people don't usually behave in a vacuum. They don't usually behave in complete anonymity. And so there's a lot more going on. This next one, the dictator game, is kind of one of the cleanest examples of game theory. And player 2 here does not have decisions. Actually, technically, we need not even define them as a player. The dictator game is a lot like the ultimatum game. Player 1 gets a stack of money and gets to choose how much of that money they give to player 2. And then it happens. That's all. So you get $100 and you get to choose how much do you give to the person next to you. And if you give 1, they get 1. If you give 0, they get 0. If you give 50, they get 50. That's it. There's almost no game. So, Nash equilibrium obviously says you keep everything. There is no positive outcome for you for giving away. Therefore, you're selfish and rational and you keep all the money. Real people don't always do this. This next experiment is called the trust game, and it's a kind of an interesting one. Again, we have 2 subjects who are interacting with each other. The first subject gets a stack of money, in this case $10, and they can choose to give a portion of that money to person 2. Whatever they choose to give, the value gets tripled before it gets into the account of person 2. So say she gives 6 of her 10, she keeps 4. Those 6 become 18. So he gets 28 because he also gets his own 10. And then he gets to make the decision how much of those 28 he chooses to give back to subject 1. Think for yourself for a moment. What would the Nash equilibrium be if you're both selfish and optimal and aware of the task contingencies? As you've probably guessed, it's a very depressing situation to be in, because person 1 knows person 2 will not give anything since there's no consequences. Therefore, person 1 will also not give anything to person 2. So the tripling never happens and they both wind up with $10. Whereas if she had given the maximum, then those 10 would become 30, he would have 40. If he gave half back, they both would have double the negative, the most worst case scenario amount. So in this case, the Nash equilibrium is the worst outcome for the group, for the sum of the 2 participants, but it is the optimal outcome if each is selfish and rational. As it turns out, we can actually make subjects behave more trustingly, and we can do this using oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is a hormone that's strongly associated with human bonding, We release it when we orgasm or when we breastfeed. And we can even buy it to improve our relationship. And so when we give people oxytocin, they become more trusting and more willing to give the money to the other side and expect to get it back. Of course, if we're talking about manipulating decisions, that's a pretty relevant one. This next experiment, or this next form of game theory called the public goods game, is typically done with more than 2 individuals. And in this experiment, every participant has the choice: do I want to contribute to whatever the public good is, or do I want to not contribute? So they're free riders or freeloaders. And in this case, what happens is we take the total contribution from whoever has decided to contribute, and we multiply it again by a certain amount, and then the benefits of that are shared across everyone. Not just everyone who contributed, no, everyone in society. So you can see this is like the trust game, except it's not one-on-one, but rather it goes into a general pool. Again, what do you think the Nash equilibrium would be in this situation? Yes, you've guessed it. The Nash equilibrium says whatever I put in doesn't benefit me specifically. It gets spread out across everyone. So I'm just going to be a free rider, and I'm going to rely on what all the other people put in terms of work or money or effort or whatever. So in the Nash equilibrium, you wind up with a population consisting entirely of people not willing to do this multiplication of benefit because they would rather not do that. So this public goods pool is rather similar to the commons that you might recognize from the tragedy of the commons. And this is an aside worth making, I think. The tragedy of the commons is a description of how people treat common goods. And in the original commons was a place where farmers could keep their pigs together, which was more efficient than everyone having their own. And the care for these pigs would be paid based on the town. The word commons in Dutch means meent, and is actually the source of the Dutch word gemeente, which is municipality. Only interesting if you're Dutch, sorry. So the situation in the tragedy of the commons is it might be worthwhile to keep your pigs there, but since it's free to keep them there, or rather you're only paying taxes, it actually becomes advantageous to keep more than you technically should, right? If you were the one to pay for the care of your pigs, then you might keep 1, but since it's free, you might keep 5. And not just you, your neighbors too, right? This is rather similar to the free riders thing. So what happens is that people are in that case willing to take advantage of a public facility to the extent that it becomes unusable and that it becomes disadvantageous to the population, the fact that it exists. This is essentially the same kind of structure as we see with overfishing of the oceans. The fact that everyone knows that depleting the fish populations will be bad for business as a fisherman. But they also know that if you're the fisherman who keeps fishing and everyone else is willing to reduce their amount of fishing, then you benefit. So there's a situation where your individual, rational, selfish choice is to abuse a public resource to the extent that you break it. It's in your best interest for everyone else not to, but not for yourself. This is a problem. The same goes for global warming. Every country knows that they have the best possible outcome if they stop emitting CO2. But they also know that they have a better outcome if everyone else stops and they don't, right? And this is a big issue. This is the nature of human selfishness versus cooperation, is the ability to get beyond these kinds of situations and to make a deal saying, hey, we could all benefit by contributing to the public goods instead of trying to sit around and hoping others will. All right. So, I mentioned it before. A lot of this game theory stuff, it matters a lot whether we do only a single interaction or multiples of these. There are two very important factors when it comes to applying game theory that's not one-shot and anonymous. The first one of these is reputation. I've mentioned before, as a biologist by training, I don't feel like I understand things properly until I understand the evolutionary pressures behind them, right? Reputation is a big one of these. If you behave in a way that is selfish and rational within the context of your experiment, and your opponent goes, wow, you know what that guy did? He didn't give me anything. He offered me 1 and kept the 9. Suddenly, there's an effect going on where a lot of others are going, wow, he's kind of an beep. Yes, I filtered that out. And so being seen to be doing good is actually worthwhile. If humans didn't evolve in mega cities of millions, right? Humans evolved in groups of like 50 to 150 individuals for the most part of history. And so reputation isn't just this abstract thing. It is really the way your immediate members of your species think about you. This is relevant. So if you get a bad reputation because you're cheap and selfish, this might very well affect the number of people willing to share their food with you when you've had a bad day in hunting, but also the number of people willing to, create offspring with you, which evolutionarily is kind of relevant. The second example is a lot more straightforward. This is the concept of reciprocity, the feeling of give and take. And this brings us to the next concept, which is reciprocal altruism. And this one matters within the task that we do. If you can accomplish more by cooperating than you can alone, and you have multiple interactions, then it can actually be rational to extend your cooperation to the other simply because you can accomplish more together. And this has the underlying expectation, I did this for you, and now it's your turn to repay the favor. This concept of reciprocal altruism doesn't always completely hold up. If we take the dictator game, for example, then a reciprocal altruist doesn't actually have very much to gain. Take the extreme example where you are a completely altruistic person and you share half of the money. So the receiver of the dictator game gets $50 here. And then it's their turn. And they are completely altruistic as well, and they give $50 back. You make it entirely fairly shared. Then what you get in total after 2 trials is $100. Go back to the Nash equilibrium situation, where you're selfish and rational and you keep your $100. The other person is selfish and rational and they keep their $100. You still wind up with $100 in 2 trials. Which means that there is literally nothing to gain in terms of reciprocal altruism in this task. You know why we don't care? Because reciprocal altruism is an example, the dictator game, I should say, is an example of a zero-sum game. There is nothing to be gained by cooperating because there's purely what I can win and what you can lose are the exact flip sides of the same coin, right? These things don't really happen in nature. We were not evolved to deal with zero-sum games because very, very few real-life interactions are zero-sum games. Someone in chat's already saying, well, you also gain something that's not measured here. Yes, of course you do. You gain the respect of people. You're seen to be good. These are all worthwhile things. They're more on the reputational side. But even if we limit ourselves purely to analyzing reciprocal altruism, so the willingness to cooperate because you expect the other to cooperate with you, most things in real life already carry their benefit within that task. If you are a hunter in a group of hunter-gatherers, and as a group of 6, you might be able to take down a really big prey, whereas by yourself you might have a harder time and you might wind up with less. That's an example of a non-zero-sum game, where the benefits of winning together are higher than the sum of the benefits of winning by yourself. And even if, another example, if you are the kind of hunter who, when he returns with his prey to the camp, shares it with the neighbors who didn't catch anything, then on the days where you don't catch anything, you still get to eat because they share with you, right? So this acts kind of like an insurance. You pay when it's good and you get when it's bad, and this levels out the costs of having a rough time. So in real life, zero-sum games are exceedingly rare. In our evolutionary histories, zero-sum games were exceedingly rare, which is why we don't evolve to understand things as such unless we study economics. So, that was a bit mean of me. Never mind. When we get back to the game theory things that I described before, these are all not zero-sum games. In the prisoner's dilemma, there is something to be gained by cooperating together instead of defecting together. In the trust game, there's something to be gained. In the public goods game, there's something to be gained. And even in the ultimatum experiment, that's a really simple one, there's still something to be gained. Why? Because there's an outcome where no one gets anything because it gets rejected. So simply making outcomes that don't get rejected already is an example of a win-win. So in all of these, the Nash equilibrium is not necessarily the group optimum, and there is something to be gained by cooperating instead of antagonizing each other. In this this next segment of the talk, I'm going to be going over forms of punishment and the way punishment affects our behaviors. Because, of course, we've already talked about reward as a way of manipulating decisions, but punishment is also a common way to manipulate decisions. Now, I've told you before about the public goods game, and in this social dilemma experiment, there was a follow-up step. So this group of subjects plays the public goods game, and those who contribute go into a big pool, it gets multiplied, and it benefits everyone. But then, in the second stage, the cooperators are allowed to do altruistic punishment. If you remember, altruistic punishment, like in the ultimatum game, is where you choose to spend some of your own money to punish someone else for misbehaving. In this case, the cooperators were allowed to spend their money to punish the free riders. And for every point that they spend, they can subtract 3 from one of the free riders. Now, if we do this within the same group over multiple sessions, then what we see is, so this is just to flip the order around. What we see is that if the cooperators are allowed to punish the freeloaders, then the level of cooperation over successive trials goes up, because it becomes disadvantageous to be a freeloader because you'll get punished for it. In situations where you don't have this, then you'll see that gradually the level of cooperation goes down. If we flip the order of doing them in one versus the other condition, we still see the same effects. Before I go into the next bit, I'd like to take a brief aside again, because the next bit is talking about fair sharing between people, and it's worth noting what we think fair really means. This is because treating people the same within a small system might still be treating them very unfairly based on the context of how they arrive in the system. For example, we see that smart children have less chances in education when their parents are not highly educated, even though they are the same level of intelligence. And our idea of what fair is can be fairly misguided. A cool example of this is how speeding tickets are treated in Finland. I should note, Finland is actually not in Scandinavia. What they do is the height of your speeding violation ticket is based on your income. And honestly, if you remember the diminishing marginal utility that I talked about in the last class, this makes a lot of sense. If your goal is to change the behavior of the speeding driver, then your goal is to make a difference in their level of happiness based on the amount of money it costs them. Now, if someone is a single mom on welfare and can barely afford to own a vehicle, then a very small fine is going to be a big utility cost. Basically, she cannot afford to get a parking ticket ever, which means that a speeding ticket ever, which means that it might be a little bit on the strict side for her. Conversely, if you're the CEO of a big multinational and you get a $500 ticket, you might be like, yeah, I don't know. I don't care. Send it to my secretary, make sure that it gets paid. So if our goal is to change behavior, then we need to make it fair on the utility axis and not on the absolute amount axis. So that's kind of what this system does. Make sure that it's fair for the person rather than treat it the same in a financial system. Right, that was a left-wing aside. So this next experiment goes a bit into the tendency for people to want things to be fair, to want things to be equal between them. This experiment doesn't have any kind of cooperation norm. You don't have a shared outcome that is beneficial to the group if you cooperate, right? If you wind up with more, you didn't do this, you didn't earn it, you just got more from the task. So there's an experimenter, and the experimenter hands out money. And the money is not the same for everyone. So I might give $30 to this rage face, and 50 there, and 20 there, and 15 there, right? And at that point, we give people the choice to give money away to others. And also to take some. Or to make people have less. So in this experiment, we see that there's a tendency for people to give to the people who have less and to reduce the amount for people who have more, which intuitively makes a lot of sense to me. And so what we see here is in the colors, we have the different trials in a single run. And what we see is that if you're fairly low in how much you were randomly given at the start, you're given a lot more. If you're fairly high, then you're given a lot less, or you might even have your amount reduced. Yeah, so this is the increase in the amount you have, and this is the decrease in the amount you have. So basically, if you got the shitty end of the stick, people help you out. If you were really lucky, then people are willing to take from you to help people out, right? So this shows that, okay, people are willing to make things more equal, make things more fair amongst themselves. That's nice, I guess. But it turns out that this is fairly limited. If we do this among multiple groups, then what we see, I should not show the public goods game here because this was still purely handing out. If we create a set of people as a group and another set of people, and we define them as another group, and you can do this arbitrarily, then what you wind up with is people mostly willing to rearrange stuff within their group with very little eye for differences between the groups. And so what we basically see here is that there is a drive for fairness among us, but unfairness towards them doesn't bother us nearly as much. Now, if you think of this as, for example, being willing to help people from your own social level who wind up in a misfortune situation, but not the homeless guy in the street, that's rough. If you see people willing to help the homeless guy in the street, but not the people starving or burning on the other side of the ocean, again, rough. So people's willingness to make things fair seem to be very strongly tied to our in-group and our own little circles. Makes a lot of sense if you think about what I said about altruism, within parochial altruism, where we are willing to work for our group, but as at the expense of the other groups, right? I don't like it, but it does seem to be a lot of the background of how humans intuitively do things. This next section is on informal punishment, which is a very, very simple concept. It's basically where we don't cost people money or food, but we express what we think of them when we are unhappy about what they did. So this can be via simple social behavior, like giving someone an angry look or telling them that what they did was not okay. And informal punishment can be studied in an experimental setting as well. Here we're back to the dictator game. The dictator game is the one where player 2 basically doesn't play. Player 1 gives money and player 2 has to accept. There is no option not to. Now, an interesting effect here is if the dictator knows that the recipient will be allowed to type a response to what he does, he'll already be more likely to give a favorable offer. So the dictator, for example, gives 20, and the recipient responds with some choice words that I will not repeat for the camera. Then simply knowing she'll be allowed to say something nasty to him means that he'll already be more likely to give more of the money. So knowing you will face a verbal consequence already affects your decision making. If we extend this to the ultimatum game, there's another effect here, which is also interesting and relevant if you want to manipulate people's decisions. So, in the ultimatum game, player 2 does have a choice, right? She gets to choose to accept the deal as it's made or reject it. So, again, we get an unfair offer from player 1. Now, if we give player 2 the option to say something unpleasant to player 1 because of his offer, she'll be more likely to accept an unfair offer. If you're looking to manipulate people, this is a relevant one. People are more willing to take shit from you when they have the opportunity to tell you how they feel about it. For example, if you're a company, simply having a complaint department, even if you never read it, might make people more willing to take your nastiness. Let's put it like that. Basically, what happens is that her desire for punishing him has already been satisfied by the verbal part, and therefore she has less need to also punish him financially. So, informal punishment is something that we can also see to an extent in the animal kingdom. Let's see if I can make this play. Yes, I can. So what we see here is an experiment done with apes, with chimps, and the tokens here represent whether the ape makes a pro-social or a selfish choice. If the ape gives a red token, then that means that only the ape that chose the token gets a reward. So the ape on the right here gets nothing, whereas the ape on the left gets a reward. And the ape on the right is not happy about this. You can see him expressing this negativity. On a pro-social choice, there's a green token, and now this means that they both get a reward. That obviously makes the chimp on the right way happier. So both of them get something, and this is nice. Now what's interesting is that, okay, the baseline is kind of more towards pro-social. If the right chimp tries to get the attention of the left one, the pro-sociality goes up. But if there's a lot of badgering and annoying and negativity from the chimp on the right, then the pro-social choice actually goes down. So what this means is that by choosing pro-socially or selfishly, it's kind of a feedback on the way the right chimp behaves. If the right chimp is nice and plays along, then there will be cooperation in the form of pro-social choice. But if the right chimp gets angry and annoying, then we get more selfish behavior. All right. Now, it's worth noting that the kinds of informal punishment that we extend and that we receive don't just affect the recipient directly. Because this is the point of informal punishment, of expressing your unhappiness with the situation, isn't just making that person aware that their behavior was not okay. It's also about making the people in your environment aware that that behavior is not okay. It means that they're less willing to behave that way towards you, and it means that anyone who hears this kind of punishment gets not just the punishment that you're unhappy with them, it gets the punishment that your behavior is outed towards the people around you. And remember, reputation means willingness to cooperate with you and willingness to generate offspring with you, both very relevant factors in it. So what we see is that we are not just being nice so that the person we're being nice to sees this, but this is affecting our entire standing in the community. And while these might seem fairly shallow and morally unsatisfying reasons, I'm not just talking about the reasons we as individuals do this. That's important to note. I'm trying to explain the evolutionary pressures that gave us the genetic background to behave this way. We don't have to be superficial and selfish in our behavior, but the reason we wind up with these genes is because we have an evolutionary background that doesn't care about morality as long as it gives results. If you think back to the hawks and doves thing from my previous lecture, basically you could have a population with a bunch of sincerely altruistic people and a bunch of insincerely altruistically behaving people, and depending on the context, one might be more advantageous or the other. So we'll probably see a mix of both of these in real people as well. Still on the concept of punishment, here's another experiment which studies the way we treat people from our own group and from another group. And for this experiment, they actually made the outgroup an active opponent because they chose to rival soccer teams or football teams, if you're not into hand-egg. And in this experiment, subjects get information that the other person is either a fan of the same soccer team or of the rival team. And then on every trial that they go into, they are informed how strong the pain will be that the other subject will experience. So there will be a shock, and the pain bar indicates whether this will be a little bit or more or very strongly. Yeah. So it's a German word, Schadenfreude. In Dutch it would be Leedvermaak. I think the English borrowed the German word there. So what we see is okay. There's an indicator of the extent of pain, and then there's a shock, and then they are giving a rating of how they enjoyed this and stuff. However, in some of the trials, they're given a choice. So what happens is they get a pain bar, and then they get to choose, do you want to share this pain with the other subject? So you take part of the shock and they get part of the shock, so it gets distributed. Or do you want them to suffer the entire amount by themselves? And they can then watch a soccer video while the other one is in pain, or they can actually watch as the other one suffers. So what do we see? So the in-group is when you are a fan of the same soccer team as the other person, and out-group is when you're a fan of the rival team compared to the other person. So we see that people are more likely to choose to help the people from their own team, and less likely to help the people who are a fan of the other team. The levels for watching a video seem fairly similar, but the response in actually choosing to watch them in pain becomes way higher when it's the rival team. So they did this in the MRI scanner, and it turns out that in the first session, the extent to which they showed reward activity when seeing the other person in pain predicted how likely they were to wind up helping them in the second session. So in the first session, they didn't have the choice yet, but based on their reward, so nucleus accumbens is the reward center of the brain, and based on activity in this reward center, they could predict whether they would be willing to actually help the person from the other team in the second experiment. So that's a lot of ways to manipulate decisions based on groups and based on standing. I have a couple more videos that are worth looking at. We've already seen this one with the selfish and the pro-social choice. This is an experiment, a very old one, about cooperation, so shared efforts, another way to make people make decisions. So one of these chimps has eaten, and the other has not. So one is motivated, and the other less so. In this case, they're both cooperating, which is fine, and they're both happy. But now watch what happens if one of them cares about the task, and the other is not really all that interested. Oh yes, classic video. Here, come, work. But I don't want to. Hey, get back here, right? So you can see that there's all kinds of social behavior going on, basically trying to encourage pro-social behavior from the ape who doesn't really care about the food right now. All right. This is a somewhat similar experiment, also done by Frans de Waal, because it turns out that elephants are quite smart. You just have to build big experimental setups to make them do things. Now, in this case, there is a rope going here behind this object and here. So if you only pull on one side, then you don't actually pull the object towards you, right? So you don't get a reward. But if you pull on both sides, then you can pull the food towards both of you. So again, this is a cooperation task. It's interesting to note that the elephants can actually make an interesting selfish choice here as well, because what they can do, and this is was not exactly what the experimenters were looking for, they can step on the rope and have the other person do all the pulling. I say person. Oh, well, I say person. Fine. Have the other subject do all the work. So in this case, this elephant is not actually pulling, just stepping on the rope, making that one do all the hard labor. Capitalism. All right. So yes, as I said, capitalism. All right. That's it for this class. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, watching. If you're watching this on Twitch, there will be time for questions later. If you're watching this on YouTube, your questions are very much welcome in the comments.